Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I direct the US and Americas program here at Chatham House tonight and this afternoon for those of you joining us from Washington, New York, from across the United States. Tonight here in London, I am very deeply honored to have such a distinguished guest and colleague join us for a very important conversation on COVID-19 and the US economy. Is the recovery slowing? We have two very remarkable women joining us to talk about this. I would like to say, by way of entry into this conversation, that over the course of the last 18 or 20 months, we've tried to focus one of our speaker series very much on the US economy, on the domestic politics that are driving the economy, on pure economic policy. And we've had a series of distinguished guests from Larry Summers, Jason Furman, Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, and former Secretary Treasury Jack Lew. But we haven't had you, Professor Cecilia Rouse, and we are deeply honored to have you. You are currently the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for the Biden administration. It's hard to think of a more important and influential and impactful role at this moment in time. You were also a member of that same council in the previous Democratic administration for President Obama, and you worked in the Clinton administration. But you are, and I admire this part about you so much, you are a very well-known professor for your work as a labor economist on the economics of education. You were formerly dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. You are currently still on leave, the Katzman Ernst Professor in Economics and Education. So you've not only contributed at the level of public policy at the highest levels, but you've influenced students across many years and generations. And we all know that that matters because those people go on to influence public policy as well. So thank you for your contributions and thank you for being here. You will be in conversation with Linda Yu, who is most well known to us because she's an associate fellow on the US and Americas program at Chatham House. She's a very well-known author and economist. She is appointed at the University of Oxford as an economics fellow, Diplomacy Commission, of which I was a member, and you presented your work to us. So thank you for that, Linda, and thank you for doing this. The conversation tonight, of course, comes at a moment when the Build Back Better legislation has gone to the Senate. Those of us based in the United Kingdom are watching and trying to understand whether President Biden is a transformative president, whether the US economy is going to recover, whether inflation is a real thing. We're watching the polarized and partisan debate over this. We're puzzled, we're confused, and we are very cautiously hopeful. So we look to you, Professor Rouse, to understand, and Linda to lead us through this very important conversation. Thank you. We're on the record. So you will be on the record when you have a moment to ask questions, and we are recording. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Leslie, for that perfect introduction, and just a warm hello and welcome from me to Cecilia and to all of you in the audience. As Leslie mentioned there, we will be in conversation, and then there'll be a chance to have a Q&A. So you will receive instructions in the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll turn to Q&A in the back part of this webinar. So how timely this is, Cecilia, to be speaking to you about the US recovery. So just to add my sincere thanks for you taking your time out of your busy schedule to do this with us. And just for the audience, I want to set out just a roadmap of the topics that we will cover. And I'm sure we will veer fairly wide because there's so much to cover in a very short period of time. We will talk about the status of the US recovery. We will focus on the Build Back Better agenda, and then we will look at inequality in the United States and the Biden economic plan and how it plans to address that. So just to give a bit of a steer to the audience of where this conversation is going to head. So with that, let me start with the first topic, which is what is the status of the US economic recovery, and what are the risks of a potential slowed down recovery? Essentially the title of this webinar.
Sure, why not start together? Well, thank you, Linda, and again, thank you for the lovely introduction. So I think the US is where many countries finds itself, which is we've been through the last, what is it now, 22 months of a pandemic that was highly infectious and required, in order to keep, to minimize the physical harm, the public health safe, in order to minimize the harm in the public health side, we had to power down our economies. And that's because we needed people to stay socially distant, and economic activity is often inherently about interaction. And so we needed to power down. The United States, we found ourselves, like many other countries, almost 2 years ago, in a sudden lurch where we lost, over the space of just 1 or 2 months, about 20 million jobs. Unemployment surged to 14.6%. We had a big drop in our GDP. So, that was almost 22 months ago. The Congress then passed a historic aid package called the CARES Act, which the United States followed a path that some other countries did not, which is that we had a small package. This is the part that was common, is we had a small package called the Paycheck Protection Program, where we encouraged employers to retain workers, and we gave them the assistance to continue to paying workers, even if the workers were not coming to work. Excuse me. But we largely said, if people need to become unemployed, that's fine. And we enhanced our unemployment insurance benefits and gave direct stimulus checks, direct checks to families. So there were other puts and takes. There were other bits around the edges. Those are big pieces of it. Fast forward to December, many people those checks had been spent. We're still into this pandemic. It's 9 months later. Congress passes a smaller version. And then in January, President Biden took office and we passed the American Rescue Plan, which was another very large stimulus. And the components of the American Rescue Plan that we believe are very important were, one, additional checks for families, but two, it also provided and underwrote the distribution for vaccines. The vaccines were developed under the prior administration, but it was really the COVID team, which sadly is still intact, the COVID team in the White House that developed a very effective strategy for getting the shots out across the country. We continued the unemployment insurance benefits, understanding that this pandemic, that the economy was going to be at the mercy of the pandemic through September. And so we really wanted to provide the resources. We provided resources to state and local governments. We wanted to have the resources for us to get through. Okay, so where are we now? So we know that the US economy has, had a very fast growth in the first 2 quarters. It slowed in the 3rd quarter due to the Delta variant, but the GDP level is above where it was at the beginning of the pandemic. Our unemployment rate has fallen to 4.6%. So on many metrics, our economy continues to power along and is making very solid gains. I was just reading, we have the start of new businesses are at record highs. So on many metrics, our economy is doing very well. Obviously, there are risks, and we know that there are risks. The first risk, I am somebody who fundamentally believes that this economic downturn is due to the virus, and we were at the mercy of the virus. So the first risk is the virus. So in the United States, we had a Delta surge over the late summer, fall. Cases were receding. We're seeing cases tick back up. I think many other countries are having the same experience. We are doing an aggressive push for those who were fully vaccinated in the spring and summer to get a booster shot. We still have an uncomfortable percentage of adults who are not yet vaccinated. But we have opened up vaccinations, for our adolescents. That's been for the last 6-7 months. But we also now have a big push to vaccinate our 5 to 11-year-olds as well. So, vaccinations, I believe, are really our key the key out of this pandemic. So we have that big push, but we see that the cases are rising. For fully vaccinated individuals, the cases may not be the right metrics to be watching. Hospitalizations, death rates may be more at issue, but we see that's a risk. The second risk is on the economic capacity side. So we're all facing these supply constraints. And that I'm sure we'll talk about that much more in the course of our time together. But we know that there are, the supply chain challenges that we have here in the rest of the world as well. And that's causing, given that people have been trying to spend and have been spending on goods rather than services in the United States, we have some pressure on our, have excess demand for goods, if you might call it that, an increased demand for goods, and that has caused challenges on the supply side. The throughput at our ports is actually higher than it was pre-pandemic, but it's like more goods trying to get through a narrow passageway. Our ports are open. We see that some of the backlogs are easing over the last 1 or 2 weeks. So we are optimistic there, but we know supply constraints are an issue. And then finally, we can go to the labor supply. Our labor force has made great gains in recovering and coming back to work, but we know we still have, many challenges of people still not quite either ready to come back to work due to childcare issues. We had an excess number of people who retired early throughout this pandemic, and the pattern there is that they retired early and they're not coming back. Retirement is a fluid concept. Someone may retire from their first job, but then they go home and they're not just sitting around, they may take another job. And we don't see people coming back. I think that there's a group of those that will come back as the economy gathers even more steam. And importantly, when we feel like the pandemic is more under control. I mentioned the care side. And then we know that there are mental health issues in the United States. The CDC reported we had a record number of suicide, not suicides, but of drug overdoses last year. So that goes to the mental health challenge that we have. I think, that is an aspect that we will need to wrestle with. So I think we're recovering from a pandemic that was really quite severe. We're making strides, but there are certainly risks on the horizon as well.
Great summary. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Let me just pick you up on the third risk about labor supply. So about more than 4 million workers left the labor force since the start of the pandemic. So your labor force participation rate is still about 1.7 percentage points below what it was before the lockdowns. And so just talk us through, I know this is also your area among many. So just talk us through what the implications of that for the recovery, going into next year. And of course, coupled with that, there have been long-term structural challenges around labor force participation rates for working age men. So just give us a sense of sort of how we should assess the labor supply issue and how important it'll be for the recovery and indeed for growth.
Well, we know we need people to be back to work, right? Firms, we make things, we have services when we bring together people and physical capital. And so the president's legislative agenda is really centered around trying to increase the productivity of the United States and the labor supply of the United States. So if we're going to focus on the labor supply piece in particular right now, so the Build Back Better plan, the reconciliation package that just passed the House and that is wending its way through the Senate now, is particularly focused on what I call human capital. I'm a labor economist, so that's getting how to make a labor more productive, how to make it easier for people to participate in the labor force, and to give us their all that they have to give. And it does so in a number of ways. One of the more important aspects is with a big push to help families with childcare. So a big piece is to lower the childcare cost for families so that no family needs to pay more than 7% of its income, obviously with an income cap there. But most families are paying no more than 7% of their income on childcare. And since that's a real complement for labor supply, meaning that I can't really go to work if I have young kids and I don't know that they're well taken care of. So in order to help me go to work, I need to know that they're being taken care of. This will be a huge benefit to those families. In addition, as part of Build Back Better, there is a commitment to universal pre-K. Most other countries have almost 100% of their 3 and 4 year olds in pre-K. In the United States, that's more like 2/3. So again, we know that when children participate in high quality pre-K, it's a great investment for them and for the rest of the society, but it also provides a place for a child to be well taken care of while that child's caretaker goes to work. So we believe that those investments will be very important for helping families go back to work. And then if we pair that with the physical infrastructure bill that just was signed into law last week, we know that there's physical infrastructure that we have not been investing in this country. And so those will provide jobs for many of the, especially men who have, we've seen their labor force participation falling. Many of these are jobs. In fact, most of the investments require the kind of jobs that do not require a four-year college degree. So these are the kinds of, working class, just blue collar jobs that are so important for us to improve the productivity of our physical infrastructure. So between those two bills, we believe that we have the capacity for providing the kinds of jobs that can get people back to work, which we need for our growth.
Yeah, I think I want to explore that plan a bit more in a moment, but the focus on human capital as well as physical capital, that is absolutely essential. And so many, so many plans kind of forget the human capital side, which is always a bit surprising. Who's going to do the innovation?
Exactly.
Who's going to be in the labor force being more productive with the digital and physical infrastructure? So I want to explore that in a moment, but that to me is absolutely spot on. But before we leave the first topic, the second risk that you mentioned, and I completely accept, the first risk around vaccinations and all of that is, I always joke that economists have played amateur epidemiologists for the past 2 years, so we are not going to do that. We're going to talk about economic risks. So it was absolutely, I found it so interesting around the kind of the focus on inflation as a real demand side. So in a lot of countries, it's both demand and supply. The ports are still clogged in a lot of places. So, I mean, this is just on a lot of people's minds, What is your assessment? How should we think about inflation in terms of the recovery, when it might ease and when it might not? And that will give us a sense as to how the recovery might look for the most important economy in the world that drives the rest of us.
Sure. So as I mentioned, the Congress and President Biden, when he came into office, very much was focused on helping families get through this pandemic, still being able to put food on the table, pay rent, and while we had everybody physically isolating, but still able to have the resources to provide for their families. So what that meant is people had the resources to maintain demand. What was happening on the other side, however, was that with the pandemic, around the world, for example, factories would be shut down in different places because of the pandemic, which meant that, things were not getting made. And then because in the United States, people had the resources to still demand things. And, if you're somebody who is used to, I don't know, going to the gym, and you're told the gym closes, but you still want to get some exercise, what do? You buy your own Peloton. So the United States, not an ad for Peloton, you buy your own exercise equipment. So what we saw was this increased substitution of services for goods. And in the United States, that's where we have seen, just if we look at the chart of goods versus services, we had, nearly, not quite a rotation, but there was a very large increase in the demand for goods and a very large decrease in the demand for services. Again, goods need to be shipped, they need to be built, they need to be shipped. And so really what this was demand stayed high, but it increased, and supply did not increase nearly as quickly. And as I mentioned, the demand got clogged in the United States. Our ports need further investment. I think they're state-of-the-art ports in the rest of the world. Our ports need investment, and that money is coming now through the infrastructure law. But we just didn't have the resources necessary to maintain the supply, so that supply couldn't meet demand. As people feel more comfortable going back to, people are already back to restaurants, but also an important service is educational services. So our public schools are slowly fully reopening, but there have been employment challenges there. So there have been a challenge getting bus drivers and finding qualified teachers. So that's one place where services have been lagging. In healthcare, we know that this pandemic has taken a great toll on our healthcare providers. And if we look at our elders, the home care sector, that's where we see some employment challenges there every month. And we know that as part of Build Back Better, actually, there's a big investment in home care for our elders because we know they need to be well taken care of, and that those are some of the poorest paid people in the country. and yet they're taking care of our most treasured family members. So as part of Build Back Better, actually, there's investments in our home care sector. So, we know that we need to have an improvement in the services side and sort of have a rebalancing to where our goods and service demands are in better equilibrium.
Really interesting. I'm going to press on to the next topic just because we are always, I could ask you tons more, but I'm not going to, so we can get through the roadmap that we set out for everybody who's taken the time to join us today. So I do want to talk a bit more about the Build Back Better agenda and sort of the two halves of it, the American Jobs Plan, the American Families Plan. Can you just kind of talk us through how to impact growth and unemployment in the US? And I think I read that the IMF estimated that this would increase GDP by 1% by 2030. And this is the one that really struck me. It would actually lower unemployment to 3%. If you could talk us through that, and also the debt and deficit considerations that would sort of form the whole picture around that.
Sure. So, the IMF has those estimates. Moody's Analytics has made similar estimates as well. And fundamentally, the increases in GDP, the decreases in unemployment come from, as I mentioned, the increases in our labor supply. So if we have more people, qualified people who are able to contribute to our labor force, and as opposed to sitting on the sidelines, both men and women, we know that that's very important. There are investments in Build Back Better for increasing the productivity of workers. So in addition to these investments in young kids, through there's an expansion of the child tax credit, the universal pre-K and childcare. There are also increases in our Pell Grants to make it more affordable for more people to go to college. Increases in funding for historically Black colleges and universities, for our tribal colleges and our minority serving institutions. So improvements in job training, so increased investments in job training. So there's also increased ways in which we want to increase the productivity of our workers that way. And then, as I mentioned, there's also just in the investment bill, there's just plain old good work that needs to be done. We have creating universal high-speed internet, making that available to everybody. We need to remove lead from pipes in almost every city in America so that children can be drinking clean and safe water in their schools and their homes. Our roads and bridges desperately need attention, and so that's making new ones, and it's also repairing the deferred maintenance on our existing infrastructure. And then there's the new investments in climate. So we know that's an existential threat that is coming our way. There's an investment in electric vehicle charging stations, tax credits for the energy sector. So all of those will be creating jobs. And improving their productivity. Like, let's take climate change. People think of the investments we need to make in order to make the transition. We often don't remember the costs of not doing so. And this year it has become increasingly obvious here in the United States with our wildfires and the hurricanes and the flooding, just how costly it has become not to make those investments. And that's part of the productivity gains as well. In terms of the revenue and deficit, so the Build Back Better is paid for. So the president is proposing to do so with, as part of the plan that was passed in the House, that there's a surtax on the very wealthy on their income taxes. There are some investments in the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, to help them have better enforcement. The audit rate for our millionaires has plummeted from something like 12% to 2.4% over the past 3 or 4 years. And so we know that there are revenues there. The president is just saying people should be paying their fair share in taxes. And the very wealthy, so this is an increase on the very wealthy in order to make these investments in our less advantaged families and children. And finally, we are full participants in the OECD global tax negotiations. And so having a minimum corporate tax rate of 15% and adhering to, the agreements in the OECD tax arraignment is also part of the revenue. So over the 10, 15 years, this is fully paid for and actually improves our economic situation. And again, it's not stimulus. This was not meant to be deficit financing in order to get through a recession. These two bills, so one law, now a plan or a bill, are really meant to be investments in our economic future.
Yeah, I think that's the part again, with your focus on human capital, I think the focus on investing to transform, prepare an economy can change its actual trajectory. And, I think over the past decade with the financial crisis, so much of it has been focused on the getting through it. So, I think just a quick summary from you about, let's assume it all passes, and I am naturally optimistic anyways, but let's assume it all passes, so in about 10 about 10 years, 15 years or so, what does this do to America's longer term? What's different about how America would look, and therefore, so we can have a sense as to how this could transform the U.S. economy.
Well, one, for those of those participants who've flown into a U.S. airport, that we once had the crown jewel of airports in the world, and that we've fallen behind on that front. So first of all, I'm quipping, but one, as I would hope that we would see our infrastructure doesn't look like it has been badly neglected over the last 20, 30 years. I would hope that you would see an economy that has transformed away from fossil fuels towards clean energy, which is just so critical. I would hope you'd see an economy where you didn't have persistent gaps in unemployment by race and ethnicity, where when we say something like full employment, we don't mean that the employment rate is 3% for whites and 6% for blacks, but maybe it's 4.5% for everybody. So that more of that economic growth and those gains have been more broadly shared. I would hope that you see for families that the federal government, the public sector, is helping them with some of the costs that are just so valuable for all of us, such as with their childcare, with universal pre-K. I would hope that we would also have a stronger safety system to help families for bonding with new children, or if someone gets sick and needs to take more than just 7 days off of work, in order to get well, that they've got paid leave, that they can do so without needing to go back to work. So that I would hope we would have a country where we understood that these are investments by the public sector from which we will all actually benefit. It's not welfare. It's not even, I wouldn't even call it, as I know in the press has been called, the social program or the safety net program. And I actually think these are ways of helping people manage work-life balance and keep their lives in balance and without going broke and breaking the bank.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really, really interesting. And I want to focus on the inequality part of it, Cecilia, the last part of what we flagged we would discuss. So you mentioned there a lot of the work that could come through construction would be geared at people who don't have a college degree. So exactly the kind of structural change that we're seeing in the economy. So just tell us about more about that and what happens when so I'm thinking of pre-distribution, basically, these kinds of policies where you are essentially trying to equalize returns to human capital and help them through the structural change in the economy, moving away from some kinds of work and moving into others, which is always very challenging. But how much, once the construction projects end, what happens to those workers while they're in these jobs for the next few years? Are there ways in the plan of helping them move into other sectors? So what are the different ways to address the pre-distribution part? Because you've covered very nicely the what we would consider redistribution part, the support, for people who are less well off.
Sure. So one is many of these jobs are not just 1 or 2 year jobs, but actually will take quite some time. But that's a fair point. If once you build a bridge, you don't necessarily, you may need to come back for some maintenance, but you don't need quite the same number of workers. So the plan is that as we make the transition from fossil fuels into clean energy, for example, even when just joking about the bridge, well, there will always be other construction. There's always infrastructure that needs to be taken care of. And that's something that we have neglected in this country that we need to stay on top of going forward. But this is where the job training comes into play. This is where the investments in higher education come into play. This is where the investments in apprenticeships come into play, which is that we all understand that there are, different people are going to learn these skills in different ways, but people need to have the opportunity to take advantage of where the new jobs are going to come from, which, we don't fully know, and I don't want to pretend to fully know. We know that we need to be making investments in clean energy. We know that much. We know that the world is becoming more automated, that technology is becoming more important. So workers need to interface with the automated world, with the computer world, and have those kinds of skills. And they need to be making those kinds of changes. And then the administration's focus on trying to identify where we can make some of these investments so that geographically they're more evenly distributed as well. So it's not just that, I don't know, New York City and California have all of the benefits and all of the investments, but that they're in, Appalachia and in the Midwest and in the South. And so that they are also more evenly distributed so that, that everybody can benefit from the kinds of investments we know we need to make.
No, that's absolutely, really good to hear. I think just on the issue of inequality, there are so many dimensions of it. It'd be really interesting to hear your take on, what else you would like to see to address some of the persistent inequality. So we've discussed sort of what's in the plan, but a kind of bigger picture. What kinds of measure should we, because this won't be the only piece of legislation. It is the biggest now, but policy is always being refined. I just think the inequality issue in America is so significant. So it'd be good to just get your take on what kinds of things we ought to be all thinking about that the U.S. could do to address it.
Well, this administration has also been very clear-eyed about racial and ethnic disparities and is looking at fair lending and looking for discrimination in other places. So, I think it's very important that we use all of our resources to their best ability. This is by race, sex, whatever it might be. But this administration has been clear-eyed that we need to address discrimination where it exists as well. There's also been a full-throated and the president signed an EO regarding competition. And so we know, for example, with monopsony, which is when there's concentration in the labor market, the one company town, workers do not get the full benefit of their productivity. They're not compensated according to their productivity. And so we know that exists in many different ways, such as with occupational licensing. Some is appropriate and is very necessary, but in other places, it may be one way of keeping employers having more control over who's in the crowd and who's not, which is a way of reducing the competition among employers to be fighting for workers. So, that's another way in which we think is pretty important to be addressing equality. The competition often has a bad name, but we actually think is pretty important for ensuring that both in the product side, that consumers are getting the lowest price for the goods and that you're getting innovation. We know when there's monopolies, there's not as much innovation. And then on the monopsony side as well. So those are two other ways, which I think are more structural, more foundational, that this administration is also trying to go at generating more equality and leveling the play. It's really about leveling the playing field, right? So.
Yeah, no, that's really good to hear. We got tons of questions coming in, but before I turn to the questions, Cecilia, I just wanted to give you a final comment on if you had to give us pointers, what are the factors that we should really be looking at to get a sense as to where the US economy is headed?
Oh, well, let's see. So well, I'm a labor economist, so I pay attention to employment. I pay a lot of attention to the labor force participation. So I am very eager to see people being willing to engage in the labor market. I think that's an important metric to be watching. Wages are tricky. Wages, I think it's right now what we see, we have wage growth, which is very welcome in the United States, especially among lower income workers. Obviously, we don't want those wage increases to become part of a wage price spiral. But in the United States, we know we've had wage stagflation for a little too long. And so I think that there's welcome growth there, but that is something that we're watching, because I think it's in the United States, workers have, I think part of one reason why we're not seeing labor supply come back quite as quickly after this pandemic is workers are saying, enough. Many workers in the United States before the pandemic had to put together 2 and 3 jobs in order just to get by. And I think many of them are saying, you know what, enough is enough. I didn't have any health insurance benefits. I didn't have paid leave. I didn't have much vacation time. And I'm just tired. I never saw my kids. I wasn't paid enough. And so if this is part of a reimagining of the bargain in the labor market between employer and employees, I think that's something to be watching too. All of this is within, it has to be within a system, and it's got to be within a system that's going to work and be sustainable. But I think we have some rebalancing that's been overdue.
Yeah, I think it's overdue not just for the U.S. economy. I think it's overdue for lots of countries. We have just tons of questions coming in. So I think I am going to turn to the first one, and then if we have a chance, Cecilia, we'll have a final sort of comment from you. So let me first go to Leslie, who needs no introduction. Leslie Benjamin.
Hi, Professor Rouse, Cecilia, that was tremendous. And Linda, wonderful questions and with a great level of knowledge behind them. I especially appreciated your comments on inequality, of which we know there are many kinds. But I want to ask you a slightly different question, which is the polarization question and the political question. Because as I listen to you, I'm reminded of one of the comments that I found myself making on a panel in the aftermath of the Brexit vote and before the Donald Trump vote. And that was, we can say all we want about doing the things that really will radically, and I do believe this is important and it's true, will radically alter people's lives in an everyday way. But the thing that, as we all know, and you more than any of us, I'm sure, is that there are a lot of things that seem to be impervious to rational material arguments and incentives. And I was looking at the chart that Pew put out last year on polarization that shows that over 80% of Republicans and over 80% of Democrats who voted for Biden or Trump believe that the other party is a threat to the nation's well-being. That's up from in 2014, those numbers were at under 40%. So under 40% to over 80%. So you are making policy and passing legislation in the context of a country where people who stand to benefit, but for whatever reason are locked into a narrative on the other side of the political divide, don't trust and don't believe you.
Yep.
And so my question is, you sit here, you are a very distinguished labor economist, you're working with economists and you're working to the president, but economic policy doesn't exist in a vacuum. So what are the levers that you're using from a policy perspective? How are you getting the message out in a way that doesn't just, lock us into these bubbles? How do you actually make people aware and believe not only that the benefits are real, but they're actually more important than the political divides that they're deeply committed to right now?
Okay. That's, quite frankly, Leslie, that you've asked the really big question. This president firmly believes that our democracy is at risk and believes, very deeply that there's a role for government, that our government has not been stepping up. But most importantly, it's imperative that we show that our democracy can deliver for the American people. And yet you just highlighted the context in which he's attempting to do this. Look, I'm the economist. I think from my perspective, I went into economics in order to address social issues. I like the framework that economics provided. I believe that part of my role when I do policy is to do some of the analysis, but it's also to help translate the economic benefits or the economic analysis for other people who may not have studied economics for 2,000 years as I have. And so what I can do is try to give talks like this, and maybe I'm speaking to bringing coals to Newcastle, and I should be, we need to be out speaking to other people. This morning, I gave a lecture to students at Harvard who are actually asking the same question. They didn't ask it in quite the same way, but it was essentially the same question. And so I do think it's incumbent upon this administration to explain what's in these bills and what the potential benefits are. This president is committed to bipartisanship. You saw that in his personnel announcements today, and that renominating Jay Powell to be chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Not only was he underscoring his faith in Chairman Powell's ability to steer the Fed through the choppy waters that we know lie ahead. And I realize I didn't answer your question, Linda, about how long we're going to have inflation with us. But it was also because he wanted to go back to the tradition of reappointing a chair who was doing a good job, even if that chair was from a different party, in the spirit of bipartisanship. It was very important to this president that the infrastructure law was passed on a bipartisan basis. So we have hard work ahead of us. I don't want to pretend that there's, this are easy roads ahead. And I think we're all trying to understand, how do we get here and how do we get here so quickly? I think many of us have at least part of an answer to that. But that is the challenge facing us today, because truthfully, these investments are so long overdue in the United States. They're so important. The cynicism of, we can't afford them when the Build Back Better is paid for. There's proposed revenue raisers. In the prior administration, the tax cuts in 2017 were deficit financed. They were not paid for, and they have not generated any growth. They have benefited the very wealthy and not the everyday person in the United States. And so the cynicism of now saying that Build Back Better will do the same is mind-boggling to me as an economist. I just keep trying to talk and explain, and hope that we can get through this intact.
Lovely, thank you very much. And well, I think you're very good at explaining things, Cecilia, so that adds to my optimism about where this is headed. The next question is going to come from Michael Harvey, who will ask his question.
President Biden talks of reducing inequality in the United States, and you've talked about it as well. But this has increased since the 1980s. And also, you've made no mention of progressive taxation. Do you envisage a return to progressive taxation policies, which proved so successful in reducing inequality during and following the presidencies of Roosevelt, right up until Ronald Reagan?
Well, thank you very much for the question, because that is very much what President Biden is attempting to do. In the Build Back Better plan that passed the House, there is an increase, there's a surtax. It's on the very wealthy. I think those making more than 10 million and even more than that. But the president would have made it even more progressive. And in his initial framework, he proposed something even more progressive, trying to think about ways of eliminating the stepped up basis in terms of inherited wealth. I'm sorry, there's a recycling truck outside my window. So the President Biden, even in the Build Back Better framework, there is more progressive taxation there. He would have been more aggressive with corporate taxes. The 2017 tax cuts reduced them to 21%. The administration proposed increasing them to 25%, but it has to get through Congress in order to do so. Finally, I will add that with the stepped up investments in the IRS that are being proposed in the Build Back Better plan, that would be a way to improve the capability of the IRS to actually ensure that the very wealthy are paying the taxes that they are meant to be paying. that, much of their income and their wealth is generated in ways that in order to make sure and ensure that they are paying the taxes that they owe, it requires a skilled and knowledgeable IRS workforce. And so this provides the IRS and the Treasury Department with some of the resources that they need in order to build that team. So, the president is very much attempting to ensure that the very wealthy are paying their fair share of taxes and generating tax cuts for those for working families, such as with the child tax credit, which is essentially a tax cut for working Americans, ensuring that people do not pay more than 7% of their in childcare is another form of a tax cut. So those are all designed to help, reduce some of the inequality, at least as Linda put it, ex post, after being through the tax code.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And the next question, which I'm going to ask on behalf of Megan Green, who is very well known to us at the U.S. and the Americas program. She's a senior fellow here. She's described the two bills on the table are just historic in size and scope. The stimulus already passed has been more successful than anyone could have hoped. Why is it that President Biden's not getting all the boost he should from it? And if I can sort of add a bit on to that, is one of the issues of why the voters are not as satisfied given everything that's been on the table, is that a result of inequality? Because you see the economy growing well and better, but your share is just not growing as quickly.
I'm not the political strategist. And I sometimes in this job, I wish I was a PhD in psychology rather than in economics, because the American people really have done very well. In fact, even among the lowest quartile of Americans, if we look at their earnings and the wage increases that they've experienced, combined with the supports that they've had from the federal government this past almost 2 years, even accounting for price inflation, they're still coming out ahead, and their balance sheets are still something 2% higher than they were at the start of the pandemic. It's even higher for wealthier families. So that may go to your point about inequality. But the point is the American people are we are in a much different place today than we were a year ago. And then we certainly were 20 months ago. I personally suspect, again, I'm not a psychologist, and I haven't fully understood the focus groups, but we've been through, basically a war in the past 22 months. And I think we can't underestimate the psychological toll that the pandemic has had. In the United States, we're at what, 700,000 deaths. The economy has been powered down. People's lives have been completely disrupted. My children are in college. Well, one was in high school last year. I can't imagine having very young children trying to do schooling, remote schooling, helping them understand what they cannot do, trying to raise them to be socially aware when they see people wearing masks and can't fully read people's faces. I think the mental health toll of this pandemic, we are going to be learning about for quite some time. So I personally think and furthermore, I will add, you don't power down, at least we've got a $21 trillion economy. If we look worldwide, we're talking $60-70 trillion, something. You don't power that down and then power it back up without all this mismatch of supply and demand. So it's bumpy because this has just been, we've been through World War III. Just without the bullets and the ammunition. It was a little virus, but I think fundamentally what it has done to every aspect of our lives has been that foundational, that I think it was going to be difficult for any president to get through this unscathed. President Biden has done, I think, a really good job of getting the vaccinations, trying to get us through this, whether it's the vaccinations, the vaccination mandates, which are controversial among many, but we all understand there's this big negative externality for being infected with the virus, and that we're not going to get through this until the world is through this. He has been, making investments at getting therapeutics and the vaccine abroad, because we know the whole world is going to need to get through this. I just think this is going to be a very difficult period for anybody. And I think we're managing really quite well when you consider that we're continuing to make economic progress. Our poverty rate did not fall or did not increase through the pandemic, which is amazing. We don't have long lines of, if you remember last year this time, people were waiting 2 hours in line for the food pantry. We're in a much better place, but obviously we don't have our lives quite back, and that's what I think people are missing.
I think you certainly get a sense of that, around Europe as well. You certainly see it's taken a huge toll, and and I think it's just, yeah, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. We're not going to be, as I said, amateur epidemiologists.
Right.
Next question. Next question is coming from Vanessa Rubio Marquez, and she will ask it herself.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am a professor of practice at the LSE and an associate fellow at Chatham House. Thank you, Cecilia, for a great presentation. And basically, I think that you gave us a very thorough and complete vision on what kind of policies and strategies are needed to build back better. But I was wondering more about the togetherness of this Building Back Better policy. What about the private sector? What kind of private sector you need in order for this to be a successful policy? Vision, strategy, priorities, what is expected from the private sector? And thank you so much again.
Great, thank you. A good question. In President Biden's economic team, we have a full-throated respect for the private sector, and understand that is really the engine. That's our economic engine. The government is meant to be filling in where the private sector doesn't do quite so well. So, the private sector is where the jobs are coming from, right? The government is not largely creating these jobs. A lot of these investments are in the form of tax credits and grants to localities to be hiring in the private sector. And so the private sector is a completely important, if not the dominant player in this recovery. I will add that the private sector is hugely in favor of our investments in universal preschool, our investments in childcare, because they understand that in order to get workers back to work, caretakers need to know that there's a place where their children can be safe. And they also understand that while they have to wait for it, that those investments will generate workers who are even more qualified down the road. So these investments in, whether it's investments in children, because we know that pays off, investments in higher education, that will even more immediately pay off in students and job, whether it's with higher education or job training or apprenticeships, that will result in more skilled workers even much more immediately. Plus, as I mentioned before, many of the investments are actually in the form of tax credits and other incentives that are essentially lowering the cost and incentivizing the private sector to be addressing climate change, making the transition from fossil fuels.
Great. We are pretty much very much close to running out of time at this point. But Cecilia, I did want there are more questions. I'm sorry, we can't get to all of them. Cecilia, I did wonder if we could finish with a sort of more international look, because I know you've obviously been working with various bodies like the OECD. So just be really good to get your take on, how the U.S. economic trajectory, what this means for, the rest of the world. So we just have a sense of what to expect in the coming years, given how long this program is.
Sure. So, we recognize that we are part of a global economic system, and our economic partners are economic and social and other partners are very important. What we see is the US, we think of ourselves as leading the pack in terms of GDP recovery, but we are excited for all countries to be showing great growth. And in the third quarter of this year, I think most of the OECD countries outpaced us, as we were particularly hit hard by the Delta variant. So we're looking forward to that. At our OECD meetings last week, or was it the week before? We all appreciated that we are all coming out of this but that we face common challenges of supply chains, common challenges of more job openings than people who are applying for the jobs. I think the US has a particular challenge on the labor force participation side. That may be the result of the fact that we've followed the path of separating employers and workers. And then we have to knit them back together, as we get through the pandemic, and they have to find one another and find those matches, which takes longer. But we are all facing excess openings compared to the number of people who are able and willing to apply for them. And we are all now facing inflation. If you look at the headline inflation numbers, the US looks like we're doing worse than others. When we've looked at this, we see that if we take out the auto sector, we're pretty much in line with the OECD. So that's a whole nother conversation about what happened into US auto sector. But this is really by way of saying is that we are in this together, that we need to get through this pandemic, and that, fundamentally we're growing. Other countries are growing, but that we have to get to the other side of the pandemic before I think we're all fully recovered.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on, because without getting too technical, whatever it is that the US is focused on spending and investing in particular, same with other countries, there are spillovers, for the rest of the world. So this focus that you have in the United States, the spillover to other countries who are also suffering is going to be positive.
It's a global economy, so we're trading and we are all in this together.
Yeah. Fantastic note to end on. So, from me, thanks a huge amount to Cecilia Rouse, who has just been absolutely phenomenal over the last hour. I think what you're particularly impressive for lots of reasons. I mean, the inclusion of human capital in the focus, I think, has that transformative potential that lots of infrastructure plans on their own just don't have. And I think, so it's absolutely wonderful to hear about it. And also you're really understandable, which there's a definition of economics, which is the science of telling you things you've known your whole life, but in a language that you can't understand. Actually, that comes from Dick Armey, the former US congressman, but you definitely do not fall into that. So, I think, I think I always informally refer to the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors as the chief economist to the president. So I think being a great communicator there really helps. So then finally, I know Leslie did a brilliant introduction of you. When I was thinking of my introduction to you, I actually thought if you looked up in the Dictionary of Economists and you looked up high flyer, you would be there. So, and then I realized we don't have a Dictionary of Economists because probably nobody would ever look it up. But if they were to, you've just had this incredible career. And I think the fact you're bringing your expertise to bear to help the US in this critical time is absolutely hugely welcome. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to share all of your insights with us and to answer the fantastic questions that have come through from the audience. And sorry we couldn't get to everyone, but I think we are just not going to go over time because everybody should always end on time, as Leslie knows, I strongly believe in. So, so with that.
Well, thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure.
And happy Thanksgiving to you. That's the only thing.
Well, thank you. And thank you to those of you who are celebrating Thanksgiving. It's a wonderful holiday.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.